The warthog shuddered as another burst of tracer fire streaked past the canopy. Warning lights screamed across the instrument panel. Fuel gauge dropping, hydraulics failing. The left wing trailing smoke like a wounded bird bleeding out across the desert sky. Captain Brennan Cole gripped the stick with hands that refused to tremble. Sweat traced lines down her dust-caked face. The radio crackled with desperate voices. Viper 206 RTB immediately, you are hit. Repeat, return to base. You're going to die up there. Below her, the valley still burned, transport smoldering, muzzle flashes winking from the ridges like angry stars. And somewhere in that chaos, 540 Marines waited for extraction helicopters that couldn't land until someone silenced the guns. Brennan checked her fuel one more time. The needle kissed empty. Negative, she said, her voice steady as bedrock. They're not dying today. She banked the crippled aircraft toward the final gun position, the one still raking the landing zone with murderous fire. The airframe groaned, metal screamed against metal, but the reticle held true. 36 hours earlier, no one would have believed this moment possible. 36 hours earlier, she was just dead weight. The desert sun hammered the flight line like a forge. Heat waves rippled off the concrete, distorting the distant hangars into shimmering mirages. Afternoon temperatures pushed past 115 degrees, hot enough to blister exposed skin, hot enough to make the air itself feel like breathing through wool. At the edge of the apron, away from the clustered maintenance crews and their easy laughter, a solitary figure sat cross-legged on a faded tarp. A flight helmet rested beside her, a kneeboard balanced on her thigh, and in her hand a pencil moved with mechanical precision across graph paper. Captain Brennan Cole looked younger than her 27 years. Smaller than most expected. She barely cleared 5'2" and her flight boots compact and lean, with the kind of frame that made standard flight gear hang loose at the shoulders. Her brown hair was pulled back tight against regulations. Her jaw held a sharpness that some mistook for severity. Others mistook it for weakness. They were wrong on both counts. She wrote another line of calculations. Cannon harmonics at various airspeeds. The way the GAU-8 Avenger's recoil patterns shifted when the barrels heated past optimal temperature. How crosswinds affected the 30mm rounds at different ranges. The numbers filled page after page in neat, compact handwriting. This was her ritual. Every day, the same position, the same focus, the same quiet discipline that had carried her through flight school, while others washed out. The discipline her father had hammered into her bones before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. Two lance corporals strolled past, heading toward the barracks. Young men with sunburned necks and the loose swagger of those who had not yet learned what combat really meant. One elbowed the other and nodded toward the woman on the tarp. "There's the quota pilot," he said loud enough to carry. "Thinks she even knows how to start that thing," his companion snorted. "Paper credentials. Probably never fired a live round in her life. Lucky for her, cardboard targets don't shoot back." They didn't slow, didn't expect a response, didn't notice that her pencil never stopped moving, that her eyes never lifted from the page, that she had heard every word and filed it away like all the others. Dead weight, mascot, check the box pilot. She had collected these labels like dog tags from the fallen, wore them silently and visibly close to the chest where they could fuel the fire without anyone seeing the flames. The A-10 Thunderbolt II squatted on the hard stand like a creature built for violence, ugly by any conventional measure. Twin engines mounted high on the rear fuselage, massive wings designed for low, slow flight over contested terrain, and in the nose the weapon that defined it, the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon, 7 barrels, 30mm rounds, capable of turning armored vehicles into burning scrap at 2 miles out. They called it the Warthog. Ground troops loved it. Fighter pilots dismissed it. And somewhere in the strange hierarchy of military aviation, Warthog drivers occupied a space that was respected in theory and ignored in practice. Brennan had earned her wings in that cockpit, had pushed through a training program that eliminated 60% of candidates, had logged more simulator hours than anyone in her class, and followed them with live fire exercises that left instructors checking her scores twice. None of that mattered here. At Forward Operating Base Crescent, she was an afterthought, a name on a roster that satisfied diversity requirements, a pilot they tolerated because rejecting her would create paperwork but never trusted with anything that mattered. She finished her calculations and tucked the kneeboard into her flight bag, rose from the tarp with the fluid economy of someone who measured every motion, and walked toward the aircraft that had become her only sanctuary in a place determined to remind her she did not belong. The sound of boots on concrete made her pause, not the careless shuffle of junior enlisted, something heavier, more deliberate, a cadence that spoke of decades in uniform. Master Sergeant Holt Garrett emerged from behind the Warthog's tail section, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better wars. At 58, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned to compensate for damage that never fully healed. His face was weathered leather creased by sun and sand, and the kind of memories that aged a man faster than years alone could manage. But it was his right arm that told the real story. The sleeve was rolled to the elbow, revealing a landscape of scar tissue that ran from wrist to bicep. Burns, old ones, the kind that came from aviation fuel and exploding ordnance, the kind that ended careers and haunted dreams. Ironside Garrett had earned his nickname in the skies over Kuwait. Desert Storm, the 100-hour war that wasn't nearly as simple as the history books made it sound. He had flown A-10s through the burning oil fields, had put steel on target when Republican guard columns threatened to overrun coalition positions, had watched friends die and enemies burn, and somehow kept his hands steady through all of it. Until the day a surface-to-air missile found his wing and gravity found him. The crash should have killed him. The fire that followed should have finished what the impact started. Instead, he crawled free with a shattered spine and burns covering 40% of his body. They rebuilt what they could, grounded what they couldn't rebuild, and gave him a job maintaining the aircraft he could no longer fly. Now he stood before Brennan with an expression that contained neither mockery nor pity. Just assessment, the kind of look one professional gives another. "You're here early," he said. "Same time every day, Master Sergeant." He nodded slowly. "I've noticed." His eyes dropped to the flight bag hanging from her shoulder. Kneeboard calculations again. Cannon harmonics, recoil compensation at different barrel temperatures. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that most people would have missed. By hand, avionics can fail, math doesn't. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. The desert wind carried grit across the hard stand, peppering exposed skin with tiny stings. In the distance, a pair of helicopters lifted off from the medical pad rotors, beating the hot air into submission. "Haven't seen anyone run numbers by hand since '91, he said finally. "Had a pilot in my squadron who did the same thing. Best stick I ever flew with. Best eyes for terrain I ever saw." He paused. "They buried him in a valley about 600 miles north of here." Brennan said nothing, waited. Garrett stepped closer, lowering his voice even though no one was near enough to hear. "I pulled your training records last month. Took some doing. They've got them flagged in ways that usually means someone upstairs wants them forgotten." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Almost. I know who you are, Captain. I know what Viper 206 did at Red Flag. I know why they transferred you to this dusty armpit of an assignment instead of putting you where you belong." The call sign hit like a physical blow. No one here had ever used it. No one here was supposed to know. "You made the wrong people look bad," Garrett continued. "Outperformed pilots with twice your flight hours and half your skill. Some of them had family connections that go all the way up. So they buried you. Figured if they kept you on logistics and comm checks long enough, you'd quit. Save them the trouble of explaining why the best young warthog pilot in a decade was pushing pencils at a forward operating base." Brennan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone should know the truth. And because you're going to need it." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. A maintenance note, technically, but the numbers scrawled in the margins weren't part of any standard checklist. "Wind patterns for the valleys north of here. Prevailing currents, thermal updrafts, the way sound bounces off canyon walls at different times of day. I mapped it all during my recovery. Thought I might fly again someday." He shrugged a gesture that carried 30 years of disappointment. "I won't, but you might need it." Brennan looked at the paper, then at the man who had given it to her. "Master Sergeant Garrett, or Ironside if you prefer. The way things are going around here, we're past formalities." He turned back toward the aircraft. "I'll have your bird ready whenever you need it. whenever they decide to let you actually use it. He paused at the nose gear, running his scarred hand along the metal with something that looked almost like affection. They don't see you, Captain. Most of them never will. But I do. Night fell hard in the desert. No gradual dimming, no gentle transition. Just the sun dropping below the horizon like a stone into water, and darkness rushing in to fill the void. Brennan lay on her bunk in the female officer's quarters, a converted shipping container that offered privacy at the cost of ventilation. The heat lingered even after sunset, pressing down like a physical weight. Sleep came in fragments, broken by distant generator hum and the occasional thump of helicopter rotors. In the darkness, her mind drifted backward, past the endless insults, past the assignments designed to break her, past the flight school struggles and the recruiter's skeptical eyes, all the way back to Arizona, where the evening air smelled of dust and mesquite and her father's cigarettes. Master Sergeant Everett Cole had been a Marines Marine. 2 combat deployments before injuries grounded him for good. Broad shoulders and calloused hands, and a voice that could stop a charging bullet 50 yards. He raised his daughter the way he had been raised, with discipline and purpose, and the understanding that the world would never give her anything she didn't earn 10 times over. The rifle lessons started when she was 8, an old Remington bolt action that kicked like a mule and demanded respect. He set up tin cans on fence posts at the edge of their property, adjusted the sights himself, and handed her the weapon like it was a sacred trust. "Steady breath," he said. "Ease the trigger. Don't yank it, don't jerk it, don't try to force the shot. Let it surprise you." She missed the first 20 rounds, hit the dirt behind the cans, the fence post below them, the empty air beside them. Everett Cole said nothing, just reloaded the magazine and handed it back. By the end of that summer, she could hit 4 out of 5 cans at 50 yards. By the time she turned 12, she could hit all 5 without missing. By 16, she outshot grown men who came to hunt on neighboring land. Men who laughed when they saw her size, then went quiet when they saw her groupings. Her father never praised her with words, never told her she was good or gifted or special, but she caught the look in his eyes sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. Pride, deep and true and unspoken. He died during her senior year of high school. Heart attack, quick and merciless the way he probably would have wanted. One day he was there, solid and permanent as the Arizona bedrock. The next day he was gone, leaving nothing but a folded flag and a box of medals and a daughter who had no idea how to exist in a world without his gravity. She enlisted 3 months after graduation, partly to honor him, partly to prove she could carry what he had etched into her bones, and partly because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to become. The dog tags she wore against her skin were his, the originals, scratched and worn from years of service. They had given her new ones when she commissioned shiny and official, but those stayed in a drawer somewhere. These were the ones that mattered. These were the ones that reminded her who she was and where she came from. In the darkness of the shipping container, Brennan pressed her palm against the metal tags and felt their familiar weight. "I'm still here," she whispered to no one. "I'm still fighting." Morning came with the taste of dust and diesel, the chow hall buzz with the controlled chaos of several hundred personnel fueling themselves for another day of operations. Trays clattered. Conversations overlapped. The smell of powdered eggs and burnt coffee hung in the air like a fog. Brennan collected her food and scanned the room for an empty seat. Found one at the end of a long table far from the clusters of pilots and officers who dominated the center. She sat down and began to eat, methodical and efficient, treating the meal as fuel rather than pleasure. 4 Marines sat across from her. They had been there when she arrived, deep in conversation about a patrol gone sideways the day before. As she settled into her seat, they exchanged glances. One by one, they picked up their trays and moved to another table without a word. The silence they left behind was louder than any insult. Brennan kept eating, kept her eyes on her plate, kept her spine straight and her expression neutral, because showing anything else would be giving them exactly what they wanted. A shadow fell across the table. Sergeant First Class Wade Brogan dropped into the seat directly across from her tray, landing with a deliberate thump. At 45, Brogan carried the look of a man who had spent most of his adult life in places where violence was the primary language. 3 combat deployments, a silver star he never talked about, and a reputation for opinions delivered without filter or apology. They called him Hawk, partly for his eyes, which missed nothing, partly for the way he circled targets before striking, and partly because he had earned the right to call himself whatever he wanted and nobody was stupid enough to argue. So, he said, unwrapping a protein bar with the casual menace of a man chambering around, "You're the dead weight pilot everyone's talking about." Brennan set down her fork, met his eyes. "I'm a pilot. The rest is just talk." Hawk snorted. "Talk is all you've got, sweetheart. I've been in country 6 months. Haven't seen you fly a single combat mission. Logistics runs, comm checks, gear transfers. That's not flying, that's driving a taxi with wings. I fly what they assign me, and they assign you nothing that matters, which tells me everything I need to know." He leaned forward, protein bar forgotten. "I've got Marines out there every day walking into valleys where the enemy knows the ground better than we do. You know what keeps them alive? Air support. Real air support. Pilots who can put steel on target when everything goes sideways." He jabbed a finger toward Irma. "You're not that pilot. You're a checkbox, a quota, a feel-good story for someone's promotion board." The words landed like hammer blows. Precise, calculated, designed to wound. Brennan picked up her fork and resumed eating. Hawk's eyes narrowed. "Nothing to say? Would it change your mind?" No. "Then there's nothing to say." She finished her meal in silence while Hawk watched her like a predator studying prey that refused to run. When her tray was empty, she rose, bussed her dishes, and walked out without looking back. Behind her, Hawk shook his head and muttered something to the Marines who had witnessed the exchange. Their laughter followed her into the morning sun. The briefing room smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat. Folding chairs filled with officers and senior NCOs, all facing a projection screen that displayed a topographical map of terrain that looked like God had crumpled it in his fist and thrown it away. Colonel Dalton Mercer stood at the front, pointer in hand, exuding the confidence of a man who had spent 30 years making decisions and expecting them to be obeyed. At 55, he was tall and lean, with silver at his temples and ice in his eyes. A career officer who had climbed the ladder by following doctrine-checking boxes and never ever admitting uncertainty. "Gentlemen," he began, then paused with performative acknowledgement. "And ladies, Intel has identified a significant enemy presence in the Carawan Valley region, approximately 12 kilometers north of our current position. Satellite imagery and signals intelligence suggest a moderate force, possibly militia, possibly foreign fighters. Assessment indicates light defensive capability." He tapped the screen, highlighting a route that wound through the valley floor. 540 Marines will conduct a sweep and clear operation beginning 0600 tomorrow. Mechanized infantry with armored support will move through the primary corridor here and establish blocking positions at these choke points and systematically neutralize any hostile elements. The plan looked clean on the screen, arrows flowing smoothly, objectives marked with neat circles. The kind of briefing that made senior officers feel competent and junior officers feel confident. Brennan sat near the back of the room, kneeboard balanced on her thigh out of habit. Her pencil moved across the page, but she wasn't taking notes about the mission. She was tracing the contour lines, reading the terrain the way her father had taught her to read hunting ground. And what she saw made her blood run cold. The valley was a funnel, high ridges on three sides creating natural fields of fire, limited approach routes that channeled any ground force into predetermined kill zones, rock formations that could hide hundreds of fighters while remaining invisible to aerial surveillance. And the primary corridor Mercer had highlighted ran directly through the worst of it. It wasn't a valley, it was a coffin with the lid left open. She raised her hand. Mercer's eyes swept past her twice before finally stopping. "Yes, Captain." "Cole, sir, Captain Brennan Cole." She stood kneeboard in hand. "Sir, have we considered that this valley might be a deliberate trap? The terrain profile creates intersecting fields of fire from at least 3 elevated positions. Any force moving through the primary corridor would be exposed to enfilade from the eastern ridge, flanking fire from the western spur, and direct engagement from the draw to the north. If the enemy has prepared positions on those high points, our convoy would be boxed in with no viable extraction route." Silence fell across the room, the kind of silence that precedes either breakthrough or disaster. Mercer's expression never changed. "Captain, what is your current assignment at this base?" "Communications and logistics support, sir." communications, and logistics support. He repeated the words like they tasted of something unpleasant. So not tactical planning, not intelligence analysis, not operational command. No, sir, but the terrain has been analyzed by people whose job it is to analyze terrain. Your job is to track equipment and maintain communication protocols. I suggest you focus on that. Laughter rippled through the room, not loud, not cruel, just the reflexive response of people who recognize hierarchy being enforced. Hawk Brogan sat 3 rows ahead of her. He turned just enough to catch her eye, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Dead weight pilot trying to play strategist. What would she think of next? Brennan sat down, closed her kneeboard, said nothing more. The briefing continued. Mercer outlined logistics, communication protocols, medevac procedures, all the details that made military operations function, all the checkboxes that would allow him to report compliance regardless of outcome. When it ended, Marines filed out with the relaxed energy of men expecting an easy mission. Jokes about being back in time for dinner, bets on who would spot the first enemy fighter, the casual confidence of soldiers who trusted the plan because the plan came from above. Brennan remained in her seat until the room emptied. Her pencil had stopped moving. The contour lines on her kneeboard seemed to pulse with warning. A hand touched her shoulder. Garrett stood beside her, having entered through a side door that maintenance personnel used. His expression was grim. "You saw it too," he said. "It wasn't a question. It's a kill box. They're driving 540 Marines into a kill box. I know, I flew valleys like that in Kuwait, lost good men to terrain that looked easy on a map." He glanced toward the door, confirming they were alone. Mercer won't listen. His career runs on successful operations and smooth reports. Acknowledging risk means acknowledging he might be wrong, and men like him don't do that. "Then what do I do?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You wait, and when the moment comes, you don't ask permission." The compound felt different as evening approached, tension building beneath the surface like pressure before a storm. Marines checking gear, cleaning weapons, writing letters that might be their last. The rituals of men preparing for battle. Brennan walked the perimeter alone, watching the sun sink toward the western ridges. Her father's dog tags pressed against her chest with each step, the weight of them grounding her, reminding her that she had survived worse than mockery and isolation. But had she survived worse than this, the knowledge of disaster approaching and the absolute certainty that no one would listen? She found herself at the flight line, standing before her warthog as darkness gathered. The aircraft waited in silence, weapons-loaded systems dormant, ready for a mission no one would authorize. Garrett emerged from the maintenance hangar, wiping his hands on the same eternal rag. He stopped beside her, both of them staring at the aircraft. "I prepped her myself," he said. "Full combat load, fuel topped off, every system triple-checked. She's ready. Ready for what comm checks and logistics runs. Ready for whatever needs doing." He turned to face her. "I've been in this uniform for 34 years, Captain. I've seen good soldiers die because commanders were too proud to admit they made a mistake. I've seen missions go sideways because nobody listened to the people who knew the ground." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another piece of paper. More detailed than the first. Grid coordinates, wind patterns, approach vectors. The Karawan Valley, every gun position I could identify from the terrain analysis. Every angle of approach that might work. Every escape route that might save lives if everything goes wrong. He pressed it into her hand. "I can't fly anymore. My body won't let me, but I can still read terrain. And I can still prepare an aircraft for someone who might need it." Brennan looked at the paper, then at the old pilot who had given her more trust in 2 conversations than the entire base had offered in months. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me?" Garrett smiled, and for just a moment she could see the young man he had been before Kuwait, before the fire, before everything. "Because I served with your father." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Everett Cole, Gunnery Sergeant, 2nd Marine Division. We overlapped at Camp Lejeune in '87. Only met him a few times, but some men you don't forget." Garrett's eyes grew distant. "He talked about his daughter once. Said she was going to be something special. Said she had his eyes for distance and his mother's stubbornness. Said she'd probably end up changing the world if the world didn't get in her way first. Brennan's throat tightened. Her father had never told her any of this, had never mentioned knowing pilots, had never spoken about the parts of his service that didn't involve rifles and infantry. He was right, Garrett continued. I saw it the first day you arrived, the way you moved, the way you studied that aircraft like it was an extension of yourself, the way you took every insult and turned it into fuel instead of surrender. He put his scarred hand on her shoulder. He would be proud of you, Captain, prouder than he could ever say. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The desert wind whispered across the flight line. Stars began to appear in the darkening sky, ancient and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. They're going to drive into that valley tomorrow, Brennan finally said, and it's going to go wrong. Everything in me knows it. Probably. And when it does, Garrett squeezed her shoulder once before letting go. Then you'll have a decision to make, and whatever you decide, that aircraft will be ready, and I'll make sure no one stops you from reaching it. He walked away, leaving her alone with the warthog and the wind and the terrible weight of knowledge. She didn't sleep that night. Sat on her bunker with the terrain analysis spread across her lap, memorizing every contour, every elevation, every possible angle of attack. The coordinates Garrett had provided formed a map in her mind, three-dimensional and alive. She could see the gun positions as clearly as if she were flying over them. Could calculate the approach vectors, the cannon solutions, the exact moments when the GAU-8 would speak and steel would find flesh, if they let her fly. At 0530, she stood outside the vehicle staging area and watched the convoy form. Humvees and MRAPs and armored personnel carriers, their engines growling in the pre-dawn darkness. 540 Marines loading up checking gear, exchanging the gallows humor that soldiers use to mask fear. Hawk Brogan passed within 10 feet of her, leading his squad toward their assigned vehicle. He caught her eye and held it just long enough to deliver a silent message. Stay in your lane, dead weight. This is what real soldiers do. She said nothing, did nothing, simply watched as the convoy began to roll. Colonel Mercer stood near the command tent, observing the departure with the satisfied expression of a man whose plans were proceeding exactly as designed. He didn't notice Brennan watching from the shadows. Didn't notice Garrett standing beside his aircraft on the distant flight line. Didn't notice anything except his own reflection in the success he had already claimed. The last vehicle disappeared into the dust cloud, heading north toward the valley, toward the terrain that looked so simple on the briefing slides, toward whatever waited in the rocks and ridges and draws. Brennan turned away, walked back toward the communications center where she was supposed to monitor frequencies and track logistics. The assignment that kept her safe and useless and invisible. But she didn't go inside. Instead, she stopped at the edge of the building, pulled out Garrett's terrain analysis, and began to study it one more time. The sun rose over the desert, painting the world in shades of blood and gold. And somewhere to the north, 540 Marines drove deeper into a coffin that only 2 people on the entire base had recognized for what it was. One of them was too old to fly. The other was too dismissed to matter. For now, the convoy snaked through the desert like a wounded serpent, dust clouds rising in its wake and hanging in the still morning air. 43 vehicles stretched across 2 kilometers of hard-packed road engines, growling their mechanical heartbeat against the silence of the wasteland. Inside the lead MRAP, Sergeant First Class Wade Brogan checked his rifle for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. Not because it needed checking, because his hands needed something to do besides betray the unease coiling in his gut. 45 years old. 3 combat deployments. A Silver Star collecting dust in a footlocker back home. He had seen enough of war to know when something felt wrong, and this morning felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. The valley walls rose on either side as they entered the Carawan corridor. Sandstone cliffs carved by millennia of wind and water, their faces pocked with shadows that could hide anything, or anyone. Beautiful country, his driver muttered, in a kill-you-dead kind of way. Brogan grunted. His eyes swept the ridgelines, searching for the glint of glass or metal that would betray an observer. Nothing, just rock and dust in the merciless blue sky. Behind them, the rest of the convoy followed in disciplined formation. Marines who trusted their commanders. Marines who believed the intelligence briefings. Marines who had no idea that a pilot they had mocked for months had tried to warn them about this exact stretch of terrain. Brogan thought about that for a moment. The woman in the chow hall, Captain something, Cole, the one they called dead weight. She had sat there taking his abuse without flinching, eating her powdered eggs like his words were nothing more than background noise. He had seen that kind of control before, in men who had survived things that would break lesser soldiers, in operators who had learned to swallow pain and fear and rage until the moment when releasing it would actually matter. What did she know that he didn't? The thought evaporated as the radio crackled with routine traffic, position reports, speed checks, the mechanical rhythm of military operations proceeding according to plan. According to plan, the valley narrowed ahead, walls pressing closer like the jaws of something ancient and hungry. Brogan's unease sharpened into something closer to alarm. "Command, this is Hawk 1, he said into the radio, requesting updated intel on the corridor ahead. Terrain's getting tight. Static." Then a voice from the Tactical Operations Center, calm and professional. "Hawk 1 corridor is clear. Satellite shows no activity. Proceed as planned." Proceed as planned. Brogan lowered the radio and stared at the narrowing passage ahead. His finger found the safety on his rifle and clicked it off. "Stay sharp," he told his driver. "Something doesn't feel right." The words had barely left his mouth when the world exploded. The first RPG came from the eastern ridge, a streak of fire and smoke that crossed 200 meters in less than a second. It struck the third vehicle in the convoy, dead center, punching through armor and detonating inside the troop compartment. The explosion lifted the MRAP off its wheels and dropped it on its side like a child's discarded toy. For one frozen heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the ridgelines came alive. Muzzle flashes erupted from positions that had been invisible moments before. Machine gun fire raked the convoy from 3 directions. Simultaneously, rounds sparking off armor and shattering glass and finding the gaps where flesh waited unprotected. RPG teams emerged from spider holes and rock crevices, their launchers already shouldered, already tracking targets. "Contact! Contact down!" Brogan's voice joined a chorus of others, all screaming the same word into radios that suddenly carried nothing but chaos. He kicked open his door and rolled into the dirt as rounds stitched the air where his head had been. His driver wasn't as fast. The windshield dissolved inward, and the young man's body jerked once, twice, then went still. "Dismount, dismount, get off the road." Marines poured from vehicles that had become death traps. Some made it to cover, others fell in the open, their blood darkening the sand. The convoy had driven directly into a kill zone so perfectly designed that escape seemed like a fantasy. Brogan low-crawled toward a rock formation, rifle clutched against his chest. A burst of machine gun fire chewed the ground beside him, close enough to spray grit into his eyes. He kept moving, reached the rocks, pressed his back against stone and tried to make sense of the carnage unfolding around him. The eastern ridge was the worst. 3 gun positions, at least their interlocking fields of fire covering every inch of the valley floor. The western spur held another 2 positions angled to catch anyone who tried to flank the primary threat. And somewhere in the draw to the north, he could hear the distinctive thump of mortars beginning their deadly work. They had driven into a coffin. The deadweight pilot had been right. An explosion lifted him off his feet and slammed him against the rocks. Pain detonated through his left shoulder, sharp and wet and wrong. He looked down to see blood soaking through his uniform, a chunk of shrapnel embedded in the meat below his collarbone. His left arm stopped working. Brogan gritted his teeth and raised his rifle one-handed, squeezed off rounds toward the eastern ridge, knowing they would accomplish nothing but unable to do anything else. Around him, the convoy burned. Men screamed. Radio traffic dissolved into a cacophony of desperate voices calling for help that wasn't coming. 20 meters away, a young Marine lay in the open, both legs shattered, trying to drag himself toward cover with his arms alone. Machine gun rounds walked toward him like the footsteps of an executioner. Brogan didn't think. He just moved. He broke from cover and sprinted toward the wounded man, bad shoulders screaming, blood trailing behind him like a banner. Rounds cracked past his head. One tugged at his sleeve. Another scorched across his hip, a line of fire that would hurt later, if there was a later. He reached the Marine, grabbed his drag handle with his good hand, and pulled. The machine gun found them. Brogan felt the impact before he heard the sound. His right thigh buckled, leg suddenly unable to support weight. He went down hard, still clutching the wounded Marine, still dragging him toward the rocks through sheer force of will. 3 meters. 2. 1. They tumbled into cover together, a tangle of blood and limbs and ragged breathing. Brogan propped himself against the stone leg, useless shoulder-throbbing rifle, somehow still in his hand. "Stay with me," he told the young Marine whose eyes had gone glassy with shock. "You hear me? Stay with me." The valley continued to burn around them. 300 meters to their east, a machine gun crew adjusted their aim toward a cluster of Marines pinned behind a burning Humvee. Brogan watched them work, professional and methodical, and knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. Nothing anyone on the ground could do. They needed air support. They needed steel from the sky. They needed a miracle. What they got was silence from command. The radio had been squawking continuously since the ambush began. Desperate calls for close air support, for artillery, for anything that could suppress the positions, turning the valley into a slaughterhouse. And every response came back the same. Negative. Too close to friendly positions. 200-meter rule. Cannot authorize. Brogan had heard those words before, had understood the logic behind them. Danger close fire support risked hitting your own people. Better to wait for ground forces to create separation than to drop ordnance that might kill the men you were trying to save. But that logic assumed you had time, assumed the enemy would let you maneuver, assumed the situation would allow for the clean solutions that look good in training manuals. This situation allowed nothing. The enemy held every high point, every approach was covered. Every attempt to break out had been met with concentrated fire that drove the survivors back into their shrinking perimeter. They weren't going to maneuver their way out of this. They were going to die in this valley one squad at a time while command debated regulations. Brogan keyed his radio with a blood-slicked hand. "Command, this is Hawk 1. I have visual on enemy gun positions. Eastern Ridge 3 emplacements. Western Spur 2 more. We cannot push. We cannot pull back. We are fixed in place and taking casualties. Request immediate close air support. Danger, close acknowledged." Static. Then a voice he recognized. Colonel Mercer speaking from the safety of the Tactical Operations Center. "Hawk 1, negative on CAS. You are inside the 200-meter buffer. Continue to suppress and maneuver. Air support will be available once you create separation." Brogan wanted to scream, wanted to reach through the radio and grab Mercer by his pressed collar and ask him how exactly they were supposed to create separation when any movement drew fire from 5 different directions. Instead, he said, "Copy command, Hawk 1 out." He let the radio fall and turned his attention back to the ridge where Marines were dying. "Where's our air?" the wounded man beside him whispered. "Where's the Warthog? They're supposed to help us." Brogan had no answer. Somewhere out there, an A-10 pilot was probably monitoring this frequency, probably hearing every desperate call, every denial, every second of silence that meant another life ending in the dirt. And somewhere out there, if the stories were true, a pilot called Viper 206 was waiting for a mission that would never be authorized. Dead weight. The phrase tasted like ash in his mouth. 12 kilometers to the south, the Tactical Operations Center had become a fishbowl of mounting panic. Officers clustered around screens that showed nothing but disaster. Radio operators hunched over consoles, their faces pale in the electronic glow. And at the center of it all, Colonel Dalton Mercer stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching his carefully planned operation dissolve into chaos. "Casualty reports," he demanded. "Unknown, sir. Communications are fragmented. We have confirmed KIA from at least 4 vehicles, possibly more. Enemy strength assessment. Significantly higher than intel suggested. We're looking at prepared positions, coordinated fire, possible heavy weapons." Mercer's expression didn't change, couldn't change, because changing it would mean admitting that he had sent 540 Marines into a trap that one junior pilot had identified from a briefing room map. "Options," he said. The operations officer spread his hands. "Air support is the only viable solution, sir. The convoy is too deep in the valley for artillery. We don't have ground reinforcements close enough to matter. CAS could suppress those positions long enough for organized extraction. The 200-meter rule exists for a reason, Major. Friendly fire incidents destroy careers and ruin families. I won't authorize danger close without absolute necessity." "Sir, with respect, I think we've reached absolute necessity." Mercer's eyes swept the room, cataloging the doubt on every face. These men questioned him, questioned his judgment. just like that pilot had questioned him in the briefing, just like the old maintenance sergeant had questioned him with his silent disapproval. He would not bend, could not bend. Bending meant admitting error, and admitting error meant the end of everything he had built. "We hold a protocol," he said. "Order the convoy to consolidate and prepare for breakout. Air support will be authorized once they achieve the required separation." The operations officer opened his mouth to argue, closed it again, turned back to his console with the expression of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. In the corner of the room, a figure moved. Brennan Cole had entered the TIOC through a side door, her assigned station at the communications center, temporarily abandoned. She had heard the radio traffic, had watched the drone feed, had seen the convoy dots cluster and freeze as the ambush unfolded exactly as she had predicted. Now she stood against the wall, invisible in the chaos, her eyes fixed on the tactical display that showed her worst fears confirmed. She could see the gun positions, could calculate the angles, could visualize exactly how a warthog could thread those ridges, suppress those emplacements, and buy the Marines the time they needed to extract. The geometry was brutal, but not impossible. Danger close, yes, but survivable, winnable. If someone had the skill and the nerve to fly it, she had the skill, she had the nerve. What she didn't have was authorization. "Command, this is Echo 4, a new voice on the radio, younger, more desperate than the others. "We are down to 20% ammunition. Multiple wounded. We cannot hold this position much longer. Request immediate support. Any support. Please." The please broke something in Brennan, a soldier trained to communicate in clipped, professional phrases reduced to begging, because no one would help him, because protocol mattered more than lives. She stepped away from the wall, moved toward the central display. Her voice emerged before she could stop it. "Sir, the geometry works. Give me one gun run on the eastern ridge, and I can open a corridor. Just one pass." Every head in the room turned toward her. Mercer's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to contempt in the space of a single heartbeat. "Captain Cole, this is a tactical operations center, not a communications closet. Return to your assigned station." "Sir, I've analyzed this terrain. The pilot can thread those ridges without danger to friendly forces. The approach vector from the southwest puts the gun line perpendicular to Marine positions. Danger close, yes, but manageable." "You've analyzed the terrain." Mercer's voice dripped with condescension. "A logistics officer has analyzed terrain that our intelligence professionals missed. Is that what you're telling me?" "I tried to tell you yesterday, sir, in the briefing. No one listened." The room went silent, the kind of silence that precedes violence or dismissal. Mercer's face darkened to something approaching purple. "Captain, you are relieved of duty. Report to your quarters and await further instructions. If I hear one more word from you about tactical operations, I will have you brought up on charges for insubordination." Brennan didn't move. "Sir, 540 Marines are dying while we debate regulations. One gun run. That's all I'm asking for." "You're asking for nothing because you have no authority to ask. You are a support officer, a checkbox, a quota filler who should never have been given wings in the first place." Mercer's control slipped, revealing the contempt he had hidden behind protocol. "Now get out of my operations center before I have you removed." "She's right about the geometry." The voice came from the doorway, deep rough, carrying the weight of 34 years in uniform. Master Sergeant Holt Garrett stepped into the light, his scarred arm visible below his rolled sleeve, his eyes fixed on Mercer with an intensity that made younger men step back. "I flew valleys like that in Desert Storm, Colonel. Lost friends to terrain that looks simple on satellite feeds. Captain Cole's approach vector is sound. The risk is acceptable. And if we don't do something in the next 10 minutes, you're going to lose that entire battalion." Mercer turned on him with barely contained fury. "Master Sergeant, you are maintenance personnel. Ground crew. You have no standing in this discussion and no authority to contradict a field-grade officer. Know your place." Garrett didn't flinch. "My place is making sure aircraft are ready to fly, and I've got one on the line right now, fully loaded, fully fueled, waiting for a pilot who might actually use it. That aircraft will remain grounded until I authorize otherwise. Is that understood?" For a long moment, nobody spoke. The radio crackled with fresh, desperate voices. Another position overrun. Another squad taking casualties. The drone feed showed figures moving on the ridges, methodical and unhurried, picking off Marines like targets in a shooting gallery. Garrett held Mercer's gaze for another heartbeat. Then he nodded once slowly and turned away. Brennan watched him go, watched the door close behind him, watched her last hope of authorization disappear. The radio kept talking, keep begging, keep dying. She couldn't stay here. Couldn't stand in this room full of men who would rather follow protocol than save lives. Couldn't watch the screens while Marines bled out in a valley she had warned them about. She turned toward the door. Captain Cole, Mercer's voice stopped her. If you take one step toward that flight line, I will have you arrested, court-martialed. Your career will be over, everything you've worked for gone. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Brennan looked back at him, at the silver eagles on his collar, at the rows of ribbons on his chest, at the face of a man who had never once been told he was dead weight, who had never once sat alone in a chow hall while others laughed, who had never once been forced to prove himself against a system designed to dismiss him. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I understand exactly what you're telling me. She walked out. The desert sun hit her like a physical force blinding after the artificial twilight of the operations center. She stood on the steps for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting her heart rate settle, letting the magnitude of what she was about to do take shape in her mind. Court-martial. Career destruction. Possible prison time for disobeying a direct order in a combat zone. Everything she had worked for since her father's death, every sacrifice, every insult, swallowed every night spent studying when others slept. All of it gone in the time it took to walk from here to the flight line. The radio clipped to her belt crackled with another voice. Command, this is Echo 4. Position overrun. Falling back. Multiple KIA. Where is our air support? Where is anyone? We are dying out here. She started walking. The flight line was 800 meters away, the longest 800 meters of her life. Past maintenance hangars and motor pools. Past clusters of personnel who glanced at her and looked away. Past the invisible boundary between what she was supposed to be and what she was about to become. Garrett was waiting for her. He stood beside the warthog, one hand resting on the nose gear, the other holding a piece of paper. His expression held no surprise, only the grim satisfaction of a man whose prediction had come true. She's ready, he said. Full combat load, 2,100 rounds in the gun, 4 Mavericks on the wings, full fuel. Every system triple-checked. Brennan took the paper from his hand. Fresh coordinates. Updated wind data. Approach vectors annotated with the careful precision of someone who still thought like a pilot even after decades on the ground. Winds shifting from the east, Garrett continued. 20 minutes, maybe less, it'll be coming down the valley. Hit the eastern ridge, first work west. Use the wind to carry your gun's smoke away from friendly positions. If I do this, they'll court-martial me. If you don't do this, they'll bury 540 Marines. He shrugged a gesture that encompassed 30 years of compromises and regrets. Some choices aren't choices at all. She looked at the warthog, at the ugly, brutal, beautiful aircraft that had been her refuge and her prison, at the weapons hanging from her wings waiting to speak. My father, she said. You really knew him. Garrett smiled, and for a moment the scars and the years fell away. Everett Cole, toughest son of a bitch I ever met. He talked about you once when we were both too drunk to keep secrets. Said you were going to change the world if the world let you. The smile faded. The world didn't let you, Brennan, so change it anyway. She climbed the ladder to the cockpit, the seat wrapped around her like an embrace, the familiar smell of hydraulic fluid and metal, and the faint echo of 1,000 hours of training. Her hands moved automatically through the pre-flight sequence, muscle memory, taking over where conscious thought might hesitate. Garrett stood below, watching. When she looked down at him, he raised his hand in a salute. Not the crisp regulation gesture of military protocol. Something older. Something shared between pilots who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. She returned the salute. Viper 206, he said. Give them hell. The engine spooled up with a sound like thunder gathering. The canopy descended, sealing her in. The instrument panel came alive, green lights, confirming what Garrett had promised. Every system ready, every weapon armed. She keyed the radio to the tower frequency. Control, this is aircraft 772, requesting immediate departure clearance. Static, then a confused voice. Aircraft 772, you are not on the flight schedule. State nature of departure. Emergency combat mission. Convoy in contact requesting immediate CAS. Longer pause this time. She could imagine the tower operators looking at each other, checking their boards, realizing that no such mission had been authorized. 772 negative on departure. We have no record of authorized CAS. Hold your position pending confirmation. Brennan's hand found the throttle. Control, this is Viper 206. I'm not asking for confirmation. I'm telling you I'm going. She pushed the throttle forward. The Warthog rolled onto the taxiway, gathering speed with the inexorable momentum of a decision that could not be undone. Behind her, she heard voices on the radio. Demands to stop. Threats of consequences. The desperate bureaucracy of men who understood protocol better than they understood courage. She ignored all of it. The runway stretched ahead, a gray ribbon pointing north toward the valley where men were dying. She didn't wait for clearance, didn't wait for the tower to stop screaming. Just pushed the throttle to military power and felt the aircraft leap forward like a horse finally freed from its stable. The desert fell away beneath her. The base shrank to a collection of dots and squares. And ahead, invisible but burning in her mind, 540 Marines waited for someone to save them. This is Viper 206, she said to no one but herself. Going dark. She banked north, dropped to terrain masking altitude, and flew toward the guns. In the Tactical Operations Center, alarms blared. Colonel Mercer stood frozen before the display that showed an unauthorized aircraft lifting off from his runway, climbing into hostile airspace, heading directly for the valley where his career was dying, one Marine at a time. Get her on the radio, he ordered. Order her to return immediately. Sir, she's not responding. She's gone dark on all frequencies. Then scramble intercept. Have the tower contact Regional Air Command. Sir, by the time any intercept arrives, she'll already be over the target. Mercer's hands clenched into fists. He had lost control. Of the mission, of the pilot, of everything. A captain he had dismissed as dead weight was now flying unauthorized combat operations in his airspace, and there was nothing he could do but watch. Garrett stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You knew, Mercer said. You prepared that aircraft. You helped her. I prepared an aircraft for maintenance check flight. What the pilot chose to do with it isn't my department, Colonel. I'll have you brought up on charges. You can try, Garrett shrugged. But first you might want to watch what happens when a real pilot gets to work. He turned and walked away, leaving Mercer alone with his screens and his consequences. In the valley, the Marines were still dying, but in the sky above them, salvation was inbound. Brennan flew low and fast, the Warthog eating terrain at 300 knots. The desert blurred beneath her, a tapestry of brown and gold and shadow. Her eyes swept constantly between the instrument panel and the horizon, processing data faster than conscious thought. Garrett's coordinates burned in her memory. The eastern ridge, the western spur, the draw where the mortars were positioned. She could see the battlefield in her mind, three-dimensional and alive, every gun position mapped, every approach vector calculated. The radio crackled with frantic traffic from the valley, positions being overrun, ammunition running low, wounded Marines calling for extraction that couldn't come, and through it all, the steady denial from command. Negative on KAS. Hold your position. Help is not authorized. She was the help, authorized or not. The valley mouth appeared ahead, a dark gash in the terrain where smoke rose in lazy columns and muzzle flashes winked like malevolent stars. She could see the convoy, now scattered vehicles, burning figures moving between rocks, the desperate geometry of men trying to survive against impossible odds. And on the ridges above them, the guns that were methodically destroying everything below. Brennan pulled back on the stick, gaining altitude for her attack run. The Warthog climbed reluctantly, protesting the abuse, but her hands were steady and her eyes were clear. The eastern ridge filled her gun sight. She could see the machine gun position now, sandbags and stone, forming a nest that commanded the entire valley floor. Two men working the weapon, a third feeding belts, all of them focused on the carnage below and oblivious to the death approaching from above. Her thumb found the cannon trigger. Guns, guns, guns. The GAU-8 spoke. 2,100 rounds of 30mm ammunition, each one the size of a beer bottle, screaming downrange at 3,000 feet per second. The sound was unlike anything else in warfare. a deep, tearing roar that announced destruction before the impacts even registered. The gun position vanished. Not destroyed, vanished. One moment it was there, solid and deadly. The next moment it was a crater ringed with scattered debris and the confused silence of men who would never fire again. Brennan pulled out of her dive and banked hard, repositioning for the second target. The radio exploded with voices. "What the hell was that?" "We have air. We have air support." "Who authorized CAS? Who's up there?" She didn't answer, just lined up her next run and watched the second gun position grow larger in her gun sight. In the rocks below, Hawk Brogan heard the cannon fire and looked up. Through blood loss and shock and the fog of combat, he saw something impossible. A warthog silhouette against the bright sky, banking for another pass, bringing death to the men who had been dealing it so freely. "Air support," he breathed. "We've got air support." The young Marine beside him stirred eyes, focusing for the first time in minutes. "Who?" he asked. "Who's flying?" Brogan didn't know, didn't care, just watched as the aircraft rolled in again and the western spur erupted in fire and smoke, and the sudden silence of guns that would never shoot again. Commander Nolan Thorne, moving with his SEAL element through a drainage ditch at the valley's southern edge, heard the cannon fire and keyed his radio. "All stations, this is Trident Actual. Someone want to tell me who just authorized CAS?" Static, then a voice from the TOC, confused and uncertain. "Trident Actual, CAS was not authorized. Repeat, we did not authorize air support. Unknown aircraft is operating in your airspace." Thorne processed this for exactly half a second. "Unknown aircraft is saving our people. Leave them alone and stay off the frequency." He switched channels, searching for the pilot's comm. "Unidentified Warthog, this is Trident Actual. I have visual on your position. You are cleared hot on all remaining targets. Whatever you need, we'll coordinate." A woman's voice came back, calm and professional, despite everything. "Copy, Trident. I have 2 gun positions remaining on the western ridge and mortar tubes in the northern draw, working west to east. Keep your people's heads down for the next 3 minutes." Thorne's eyebrows rose. A woman flying an unauthorized combat mission into the teeth of an ambush that had pinned down an entire battalion. "Viper 206, someone whispered on the net. The voice carried recognition and disbelief in equal measure. "That's Viper 206, the dead weight pilot." Thorne didn't know what that meant, didn't care. All he knew was that someone had finally answered their calls for help, and right now that someone was systematically dismantling the enemy positions that had been killing his people for the last 40 minutes. "All units," he broadcast, "we have friendly air overhead. Call sign Viper 206. Mark your positions and prepare for extraction." The corridor is about to open. In the sky above, Brennan Cole rolled into her 4th attack run. The western ridge held 2 more gun positions, their crews now frantically trying to reorient toward the threat they hadn't expected. She could see them moving ant-like figures, scrambling between rocks, trying to bring their weapons to bear on an aircraft that moved too fast and struck too hard. Too late. The GAU-8 roared again and another position ceased to exist. She was down to 800 rounds in the gun. 2 Mavericks remaining. Fuel burning faster than she had calculated, the damaged wing from her aggressive maneuvering, creating drag she hadn't anticipated. But the math still worked. Barely. 1 more gun position. The mortar tubes. Then the corridor would be clear and the helicopters could come. She banked hard left, pulling G's that pushed her into the seat and grayed the edges of her vision. The last gun position swam into view, its crew already running, already understanding that nothing they had could touch the death circling above them. She let them run, lined up on the weapon itself, squeezed the trigger. The gun exploded into fragments, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary blast that sent debris showering across the ridge. The crew scattered into rocks and shadows, no longer a threat, no longer part of the equation. The mortar tubes remained. Brennan switched to Mavericks, acquiring the IR signature of tubes that still glowed hot from their recent firing. The targeting system painted solutions across her display. 2 targets, 2 missiles, no margin for error. She pickled the first Maverick and felt the aircraft lurch as the weapon left the rail. It tracked true, a lance of fire and smoke that crossed the distance in seconds and turned the first mortar position into a smoking crater. The second Maverick followed. The northern draw erupted in flame and thunder, the last enemy position neutralized in a heartbeat. And just like that, the guns fell silent. Brennan pulled up and rolled into an orbit over the valley, scanning for threats she might have missed. The smoke was thick now, obscuring portions of the terrain, but her instruments showed no more fire directed at the Marines below. The killing had stopped. The radio came alive with voices. Corridor is open. Repeat, corridor is open. Extraction birds inbound, ETA 5 minutes. All units prepare for immediate extraction. Move to designated LZs. And through it all, one voice rough with emotion and blood loss, breaking through the professional chatter. Viper 206, this is Hawk 1. Brogan's words came slow, each one costing him something. Whoever you are, whatever you are, you just saved us all. I owe you my life. We all do. Brennan keyed her mic, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Copy Hawk 1. Just doing my job. Now get your people to those helicopters. She continued her orbit, watching the Marines begin to move, watching the wounded being carried toward landing zones that were finally safe, watching the first extraction helicopters appear on the horizon, their rotors beating the air into submission. She had done it, had disobeyed every order broken, every protocol, ended her career in a single act of defiance, and 540 Marines were going home alive because of it. The fuel gauge caught her attention. The needle sat lower than it should, lower than her calculations had predicted. The damaged wing was bleeding hydraulic fluid, creating drag-burning fuel faster than the healthy aircraft would have. She ran the numbers in her head. Distance to base. Fuel remaining. Current consumption rate. The math didn't work. Viper 206, this is Trident Actual. Commander Thorne's voice cut through her calculations. Outstanding work. What's your fuel state? Brennan looked at the gauge again. Looked at the helicopters still inbound. Looked at the Marines still exposed in the valley below. If she called emergency fuel now, they would divert assets to her recovery. Assets that should be focused on getting wounded Marines to medical care. Assets that might arrive too late for men bleeding out in the rocks. Fuel state is adequate, she said, continuing station until extraction is complete. It was a lie, the first real lie she had told since entering the cockpit. But some lies were necessary. Some lies saved lives. She would stay on station until the last helicopter lifted off. Then she would figure out how to get home. Or she wouldn't. Either way, the mission came first. Below her, the extraction continued. And in the Tactical Operations Center, Colonel Mercer watched the drone feed with an expression that shifted from fury to disbelief to something that might have been the first stirrings of shame. The deadweight pilot had just saved his battalion. And nothing would ever be the same again. The extraction helicopters thundered into the valley like angels of deliverance. Blackhawks and Chinooks descending through smoke and dust, their rotors beating the air into submission, their crew chiefs scanning for threats that no longer existed. Brennan held her orbit at 2,000 feet, watching the choreography unfold below. Marines streaming toward landing zones, wounded being carried on improvised stretchers. The organized chaos of military extraction operating exactly as designed. She had given them this, had carved a corridor through the killing ground with cannon fire and precision, had bought them the time they needed with decisions that would end her career. The fuel gauge dropped another increment. She was flying on fumes and willpower now, the damaged wing bleeding the aircraft dry faster than any calculation could compensate. First chalk is up. The voice on the radio carried exhausted relief. Wounded aboard, lifting now. She watched the helicopter rise heavy with human cargo banking south toward the field hospital that waited to receive them. 40 Marines in that bird, 40 lives that would have ended in the rocks if she had followed orders. Second chalk loading, third bird inbound. The rhythm of extraction continued. Helicopters landing, loading, lifting. The valley slowly emptying of the men who had been trapped there. Each departure brought the end closer, but Brennan refused to check her fuel again. Refused to acknowledge the numbers that had stopped making sense 10 minutes ago. Commander Nolan Thorne's SEAL element reached their designated landing zone, moving with the fluid efficiency of operators who had trained for exactly this kind of chaos. He paused at the edge of the LZ, looking up at the warthog still circling overhead. Viper 206 Trident Actual. My team is extracting now. Outstanding work today, Captain. Truly outstanding. Copy Trident. Get your people home. What about you? What's your actual full fuel state? The question hung in the air. Brennan watched another helicopter lift off, counted the remaining Marines on the ground, calculated distances and times and consumption rates that refused to align. Fuel state is adequate. Continue extraction. Thorne wasn't fooled. 30 years of special operations had taught him to hear what people weren't saying. But he also understood that some decisions belonged to the person making them, and arguing with a pilot holding station over wounded Marines wasn't going to change anything. Copy Viper 206. See you on the other side. His helicopter lifted off, banking hard, racing towards safety with another load of survivors. The valley was almost empty now. A few clusters of Marines at the final landing zones waiting for the last birds to arrive. And in the rocks near the southern edge, a figure that shouldn't have been there. Brennan's eyes caught the movement. A Marine struggling to drag himself toward the extraction point, his left leg twisted at an angle that meant shattered bone and severed muscle. Too far from the LZ, too slow to reach it before the last helicopter departed. She keyed her radio. Ground element, you have a straggler. Southern rocks approximately 200 meters from LZ Bravo. Single Marine appears wounded attempting to reach extraction. Static, then a tired voice. Viper 206, we're at capacity. Final bird is lifting in 60 seconds. We can't reach him in time. Then hold the bird. I'll cover him. Negative, Viper. We have wounded critical. We cannot delay extraction for a single straggler. Brennan watched the Marine continue his agonizing crawl. 20 meters covered in the last minute. 180 still to go. The math was impossible. Unless someone bought him time. She rolled the Warthog into a descent, bleeding altitude for a closer look. The fuel warning light flickered on amber, turning to red, the aircraft's final protest against decisions that defied logic. The Marine looked up as her shadow passed over him. She could see his face now, young and terrified and determined. He wasn't giving up, wasn't lying down to die. Just kept dragging himself forward, one handhold at a time, refusing to accept the arithmetic of his situation. She recognized that look, had worn it herself every day for the past 6 months. Ground element, this is Viper 206. I am staying on station until that Marine reaches extraction. Adjust your timeline accordingly. Viper, you don't have the fuel for that. Your gauge must be critical by now. My gauge is my business. Hold that helicopter. She climbed back to pattern altitude, scanning the ridgelines for any threat that might have survived her attack runs. Nothing moved except smoke and settling dust. The enemy had fled or died, leaving the valley to the Americans who had paid for it in blood. Below, the wounded Marine kept crawling. 60 seconds passed. 90, 2 minutes. The helicopter sat on its LZ rotors, turning crew chief, arguing with someone on the radio about fuel states and windows and the impossibility of waiting for a man who might never arrive. Brennan watched the Marine cover another 10 meters, then another 5. His movements were slowing, exhaustion and blood loss taking their toll. But he wasn't stopping, wasn't surrendering, wasn't accepting the verdict that mathematics had delivered. She thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught her in the Arizona dust, about the steadiness that came from refusing to acknowledge impossible odds. Let the shot surprise you. The Marine reached the edge of the landing zone. Brennan keyed her radio. Ground element, your straggler is at LZ Bravo. Extract him now. She watched the crew chief sprint from the helicopter, grab the wounded Marine under the arms and drag him toward the bird. Watch them load him aboard with seconds to spare. Watch the helicopter lift off, banking south, carrying the last survivor of Carawan Valley towards safety. The valley was empty now. Nothing left but burning vehicles and scattered debris and the silence of a battlefield after the fighting ends. All elements extracted. The voice belonged to someone in the Tactical Operations Center, reading from a checklist confirming what Brennan already knew. All units accounted for. 540 Marines recovered. 0 left behind. 0 left behind. The words should have brought relief, should have justified everything she had risked and sacrificed. Instead, they just made her aware of how tired she was, how empty, how far from home. The fuel warning light had stopped flickering. It burned steady red, now the aircraft's final warning that choices had consequences and hers were about to arrive. She turned south and pushed the throttle forward. The flight back to base should have taken 12 minutes. Her fuel would last perhaps 8. The math was simple and merciless, leaving no room for hope or luck or the kind of last-minute salvation that only happened in movies. Brennan ran through her options. Ejection was possible but would mean losing the aircraft and possibly her life if the seat malfunctioned or the terrain proved hostile. Gliding in was theoretically achievable if the engines flamed out close enough to the runway, but the damaged wing made controllability questionable at best. Or she could simply fly until the fuel ran out and accept whatever came next. The radio crackled, a voice she recognized, rough with age and scarred by decades of service. Viper 206, this is Ironside. I've been monitoring your frequency. What's your actual fuel state, Garrett? Of course he would be listening. Of course he would know. Actual fuel state is critical. Estimate 7 minutes to flame out. I'm not going to make the runway. Silence. Then, you're going to make it. I didn't prep that bird for you to crash it. The math doesn't work, Ironside. Even if I nurse every drop, I'm coming up short. Then stop doing math and start flying. You're the best stick I've seen in 30 years. Figure it out. His voice carried something beyond encouragement. Confidence. The absolute certainty of a man who had watched her train and prepare and wait for exactly this moment. Brennan looked at her instruments. Fuel flow, airspeed, altitude, engine temperature. A dozen variables that she had memorized in late-night study sessions while others slept. A dozen calculations that she had run by hand because avionics could fail but mathematics couldn't. She began to fly. Throttle back to minimum sustainable power. Altitude sacrificed for distance. Every thermal exploited, every updraft milked for the energy it could provide. She flew the Warthog like a glider, with engines trading height for range, coaxing every possible mile from a fuel supply that shouldn't have existed. The base appeared on the horizon, a cluster of buildings and runways shimmering in the afternoon heat. 5 miles out. 4. 3. The left engine coughed. Brennan's hands moved before her mind registered the sound. Fuel crossfeed activated, routing the remaining dregs to the healthier right engine. Mixture adjusted. Throttle trimmed. The left engine coughed again, ran rough for 3 agonizing seconds, then smoothed out. 2 miles. The runway stretched ahead, a gray ribbon of salvation in an ocean of brown desert. She was too low for a normal approach, too slow for a go-around, committed to a landing that would either work or end in fire and twisted metal. 1 mile. The engines began their final protest, both now starving for fuel that no longer existed, their roar fading to a rough stutter that presaged silence. She crossed the threshold at 50 feet, bleeding airspeed, the Warthog settling toward concrete with the grace of a wounded bird. The main gear touched first hard enough to jar her teeth. The nose came down. The aircraft slewed left as the damaged wheel fought for traction. Brennan stood on the brakes. The Warthog screamed, its disapproval tires, smoking airframe, shuddering with the violence of deceleration. She could see the end of the runway approaching, the dirt beyond it, the equipment that would destroy the aircraft if she couldn't stop in time. The engines died. Both of them simultaneously, fuel exhaustion, finally claiming what courage had borrowed. The Warthog rolled in sudden silence momentum, carrying it forward, it brakes fighting physics for every remaining foot. It stopped 20 meters from the runway's end. Brennan sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the controls, heart pounding in her ears. The instrument panel was dark. The engines were silent. The only sound was her own breathing, ragged and harsh in the sudden quiet. She had made it. The canopy release felt strange under her trembling fingers. The desert air hit her face like a furnace, hot and dry and impossibly sweet. She climbed down the ladder on legs that barely remembered how to support, weight boots touching concrete with a finality that meant something she couldn't yet name. The flight line stretched before her, empty in the afternoon sun. Then she saw them. Marines lined the taxiway, dozens of them, hundreds, standing in silence with helmets removed and weapons grounded. The men who had mocked her for months, who had called her deadweight and quota pilot, and worse. Now they stood in ranks that spoke of respect earned through action rather than demanded through authority. Master Sergeant Holt Garrett walked toward her, his scarred arm visible in the harsh light, his face carrying an expression she had never seen before. Pride. Unguarded and absolute, he stopped 3 feet away and snapped to attention. His hand rose in a salute that had nothing to do with regulation and everything to do with recognition. Viper 206, he said, welcome home. She returned the salute, her hand steadier than it had any right to be. Ironside, thanks for prepping my bird. He held the salute for another moment, then dropped it and did something she hadn't expected. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, a fierce embrace that spoke of decades of waiting for someone worthy of the legacy he carried. "Your father would be proud," he whispered, prouder than he could ever say. She let herself lean into the embrace for just a moment, let herself feel the exhaustion and the relief and the strange grief that came from winning a battle she had never expected to fight. Then she stepped back because there was still work to do, and she had never been the kind of person who celebrated before the job was finished. Colonel Dalton Mercer emerged from the operations center, his stride measured, his expression unreadable. The Marines on the taxiway shifted but held their positions, creating a corridor through which he walked with the careful dignity of a man approaching judgment. He stopped before Brennan close enough that she could see the conflict in his eyes. Pride and shame, and something that might have been grudging respect, all warring for dominance behind the mask of command. "Captain Cole." "Sir, you disobeyed my direct orders, launched an unauthorized combat mission, endangered a multi-million-dollar aircraft, violated approximately 17 regulations that I can think of off the top of my head." She met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir." The silence stretched. Marines watched. Garrett watched. The desert sun watched with its ancient indifference to human drama. "You also saved 540 Marines." Mercer's voice cracked on the number, the first real emotion he had shown. "Soldiers I sent into a trap because I was too arrogant to listen to a junior officer who saw what I missed." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a piece of paper. Official letterhead typed text signature block at the bottom. "This is the recommendation for your court-martial. I wrote it while you were still over the target." He held the paper up, let her see her name in the subject line, then slowly and deliberately tore it in half. "I won't be filing it." He let the pieces fall to the concrete. "What I will be filing is a recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in aerial flight, for actions above and beyond the call of duty that saved an entire battalion from annihilation." Brennan felt something shift in her chest. Not victory, not vindication, something quieter and more complicated. "I wasn't doing it for medals, sir." "I know. That's why you deserve one." Mercer straightened, his command presence reasserting itself. "I was wrong about you, Captain. Wrong about what you could do. Wrong about what you were. I don't apologize often, but I'm apologizing now." He extended his hand. She looked at it for a moment. This man who had dismissed her, belittled her, tried to end her career with a single act of defiance. This man who had sent Marines into a kill zone rather than admit uncertainty. She shook his hand. "Thank you, sir." He nodded once and stepped aside, making room for the next person in the line that had formed while they spoke. Commander Nolan Thorne stepped forward, still wearing the combat gear he had carried through the valley dust, in blood, staining his uniform in patterns that told their own story. His salute was crisp and held longer than regulation required. "Viper 206, on behalf of SEAL Team 7 and every operator who walked out of that valley today, I want you to know that we will never forget what you did. Never." She returned the salute. "Just doing my job, Commander." "No." His voice carried absolute certainty. "You were doing something else entirely. Something that most people never find the courage to attempt." He dropped the salute and offered his hand. "If you ever need anything, Captain, anything at all, you know how to reach us." She shook his hand, feeling the calluses of a man who had spent his life in service to something larger than himself. The line continued. Officers and enlisted pilots and infantry support personnel and combat veterans. Each one stopping to offer words or handshakes or simply silent acknowledgement of what she had done. The base that had treated her as invisible now saw her with absolute clarity. And then Hawk Brogan appeared. He limped forward on a leg wrapped in field dressings, his left arm immobilized against his chest, his face pale from blood loss and marked with the particular exhaustion of a man who had survived something that should have killed him. Behind him, 2 Marines hovered close, ready to catch him if he fell. He stopped in front of Brennan and stood as straight as his wounded body would allow. "Captain Cole, Sergeant First Class Brogan." They faced each other in silence. The man who had called her dead weight and the woman who had saved his life. The words they had exchanged in the chow hall hung between them like ghosts. Brogan spoke first. "I was wrong." His voice carried no pride, no defense, no mitigation. I was wrong about you. Everything I said, everything I believed, all of it was wrong. You're not dead weight. You're the best damn pilot I've ever seen, and I owe you my life. He tried to salute, but his wounded arm wouldn't cooperate. The gesture turned into something awkward and painful, a physical manifestation of the humility he was trying to express. Brennan stepped forward and gently lowered his arm. You don't have to salute me, Sergeant. You just have to get better so you can go back to giving junior Marines hell. Something cracked in Brogan's expression. The hardness that had defined him, the judgment that had come so easily, all of it breaking apart to reveal something more human underneath. I spent 20 years believing I knew who belonged in combat and who didn't. Believing I could look at someone and know their worth. He shook his head slowly. I looked at you and saw nothing, and you turned out to be everything. He reached out with his good hand and gripped her shoulder. I'm sorry, Captain, truly sorry. Not just for what I said, but for every time I made someone feel like they didn't belong when they had more courage than I ever did. Brennan felt the weight of his hand, the sincerity in his grip, the transformation that combat sometimes forced upon people who had spent their lives certain of things that turned out to be false. Apology accepted, she said. Now go get that leg fixed before you bleed on my flight line. The ghost of a smile crossed Brogan's face. Yes, ma'am. He turned and limped toward the waiting medics, pausing once to look back at her with an expression that had replaced contempt with something far more valuable. The line continued until sunset painted the desert in shades of blood and gold. Brennan stood through all of it, shaking hands, accepting thanks, carrying the weight of recognition that she had never sought and now couldn't escape. When the last person had passed, she found herself alone on the flight line, standing before the warthog that had carried her through impossible odds. The aircraft sat silent, and dark fuel exhausted hydraulic fluid still seeping from the damaged wing, its mission complete. She reached out and laid her palm against the nose, feeling the metal that had been her refuge and her weapon, and now stood as testament to what she had done. Thank you, she whispered, for getting me there, for getting me home. Night fell around her, the desert stars emerging one by one, ancient and indifferent to the small human victories playing out beneath them. The hangar was empty when she finally walked through its doors. Banks of fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the maintenance floor. The smell of hydraulic fluid and metal polish hung in the air, familiar as breathing. Brennan found her damaged warthog in the far bay, already up on jacks for the repairs it would need. She ran her hands along the wing, tracing the holes that enemy fire had punched through aluminum and steel. Each one a reminder of how close the margin had been, how easily the story could have ended differently. She pulled out her kneeboard and began to write. Fuel consumption rates, ammunition expended, damage assessment, the numbers that would fill her after-action report, the data that would become part of the official record. The hangar door opened behind her. Garrett walked in carrying 2 steaming cups, his bootsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He handed her one without speaking and settled onto an equipment crate, his scarred arm resting on his knee. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The coffee was bitter and too hot, exactly what she needed. Your father and I only met 3 times, Garrett finally said. Camp Lejeune in '87, a joint exercise in California the next year. Then a funeral for a mutual friend in '91, right before I deployed for Desert Storm. Brennan looked up from her kneeboard. He wasn't much for talking, your old man, but the one time he did open up, he talked about you. Said he had a daughter who was going to be something special. Said she had eyes that could read terrain before she'd ever seen it, and hands that stayed steady when everything went sideways. Garrett took a sip of his coffee, staring at something only he could see. He said he was teaching you to shoot. Said you missed the first 20 rounds and hit the next 50 straight. Said you never complained, never made excuses, just kept pulling the trigger until the cans fell down. Brennan's throat tightened. Her father had never told her any of this. Had never spoken about what he thought of her or what he hoped she would become. He had shown her through actions, through patience, through the steady presence that had shaped her entire life. He said you were going to be better than both of us combined, Garrett continued, and that he just hoped the world would give you the chance to prove it. He turned to face her, his eyes holding the weight of 34 years in uniform. The world didn't give you that chance, Brennan. They took it away, buried you in logistics and comm checks and support duty that would have broken anyone else. And you know what you did? She shook her head. You waited, you studied, you prepared, and when the moment came, you were ready. He raised his coffee cup in a small salute. That's not luck. That's not talent. That's discipline. The kind of discipline your father built into you one rifle shot at a time. Brennan felt the tears before she could stop them. Hot and unexpected tracing lines down dust-caked cheeks. She didn't wipe them away, didn't apologize for them. Just let them fall while Garrett watched with the patient understanding of someone who had cried his own tears in empty hangars after missions that cost more than they should have. I wish he could have seen it, she finally said. Just once, I wish he could have seen what I did today. Garrett smiled, the expression softening the scars that lined his face. He did see it. Wherever he is, whatever comes after this life, he saw it, and he's prouder than he could ever say. They sat together in comfortable silence, two pilots bound by a legacy that stretched across decades and connected through the woman who had honored it in fire and blood. The hangar door opened again. Colonel Mercer stood in the entrance, his uniform exchanged for the simple fatigues of a man off duty. He hesitated at the threshold, uncertain of his welcome in this space that belonged to flyers rather than commanders. Captain Cole, may I speak with you? Garrett started to rise, but Brennan shook her head. Stay Ironside. Whatever he has to say, you've earned the right to hear it. Mercer walked forward, stopping at a respectful distance. His hands hung at his sides, empty of the authority he usually wielded like a weapon. I came to tell you something that doesn't appear in any report. Something that will never make it into your service record or your medal citation. He paused, gathering words that clearly cost him something. 23 years ago, I was a major commanding a company in the Gulf. We were clearing a village when my scout reported enemy activity on the high ground. I dismissed his assessment, told him he was seeing shadows, ordered the advance to continue. His voice dropped. 17 men died because I was too proud to listen to someone I outranked. 17 families got folded flags because I thought my judgment was more valuable than the eyes of a junior soldier who could see what I couldn't. Brennan watched the transformation on his face, the mask of command dissolving to reveal the man underneath, the weight of old sins finally acknowledged. I built my career on never making that mistake again, on following protocol so precisely that nothing could go wrong, on never ever listening to subordinates who questioned my plans. He shook his head slowly. And today I almost did exactly the same thing. Almost killed 540 Marines because a captain with more courage than I've ever had tried to tell me what I didn't want to hear. He met her eyes with absolute directness. You saved them, Captain. Not just from the enemy, but from me, from my arrogance, from my fear of being wrong again. And I will spend the rest of my career trying to be worthy of the lesson you taught me today. He came to attention and rendered a salute so precise it could have been used as a training example. Thank you, Viper 206, for the Marines you saved, for the commander you corrected, for the officer you proved yourself to be. Brennan rose and returned the salute with equal precision. Thank you, sir, for being willing to learn. He held the salute for a long moment, then dropped it and walked away, his bootsteps fading into the night. The hangar fell silent again. Brennan returned to her kneeboard, to the numbers that would become history, to the record of a mission that had changed everything. Garrett finished his coffee and set the cup aside. Distinguished Flying Cross. That's not nothing you know. I know. Probably a promotion to follow. Maybe a transfer to somewhere they actually appreciate what you can do. Maybe. He studied her for a moment, reading the exhaustion and the satisfaction in the strange emptiness that followed moments of transcendence. What are you going to do now? Brennan looked up from her writing. Through the hangar doors, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched her fly into the valley. The same stars that would watch whatever came next. Now I'm going to finish this report. Then I'm going to get some sleep. And tomorrow I'm going to climb back into whatever aircraft they give me and do my job. She closed the kneeboard and stood feeling the weight of her father's dog tags against her chest. Because that's what pilots do. We fly. And when the mission comes, we don't ask permission. We just do our duty. Garrett rose and extended his hand. It's been an honor, Captain Cole. A genuine honor. She shook his hand, feeling the scars that told their own story of service and sacrifice. The honor is mine, Ironside. For everything you taught me, for everything you prepared me for believing in me when no one else would. He held her grip for a moment longer than necessary. Your father was right, you know, about you being something special. He smiled, the expression carrying warmth that his weathered face rarely showed. He just didn't know how special. Nobody did. Until today. He released her hand and walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Get some sleep, Viper. You've earned it. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the aircraft and the silence and the weight of everything she had become. Brennan stood in the empty hangar for a long time, letting the quiet settle around her. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song. The damaged warthog sat patient on its jacks, waiting for the hands that would make it whole again. She reached up and touched the dog tags at her throat, cold metal against warm skin. The last physical connection to a man who had shaped her without ever telling her what she might become. I did it, Dad, she whispered. I waited, I prepared. And when the moment came, I didn't ask permission. I just flew. The stars watched through the open hangar door, ancient, impatient, and utterly indifferent to human triumph or tragedy. But somewhere, somehow, she knew he was watching too. She walked out into the night, leaving the hangar and its shadows behind. The base spread before her quiet. Now the chaos of the day settled into the rhythms of routine. Somewhere Marines were writing letters home about the pilot who had saved them. Somewhere commanders were revising their assumptions about who belonged in combat and who didn't. And somewhere in a valley 12 kilometers to the north, the wind was already erasing the evidence of what had happened, covering the blood and the brass and the burn marks with sand that had buried 1,000 battles before and would bury 1,000 more. But some things couldn't be buried. Some things lived on in the memories of those who witnessed them, in the records that would be studied for generations, in the legacy of a pilot who had been told she was nothing and had proven she was everything. True courage doesn't roar. It waits, it prepares, it studies the terrain and calculates the angles and runs the numbers until they become part of its bones. And when the moment finally comes, it doesn't ask for permission or recognition or reward. It simply does its duty, and in doing so changes everything. Captain Brennan Cole walked toward her quarters, the desert wind at her back, the stars overhead, and 540 lives written in the sky behind her. Viper 206 was going home.